The entire nation froze when Donald Trump, during a live Fox interview, laughed and called Michelle Obama the most overrated First Lady in history. Barack Obama, who was watching quietly from his Chicago home, didn't move for several seconds. His coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand. Michelle's calm eyes shifted toward him. Not angry, just hurt. That silence cut deeper than any insult. It was a silence that stretched across millions of living rooms. A collective, sharp intake of breath, as a line of basic decency was crossed on live television. In that moment, the political became brutally personal, and the wound felt by two people was shared by an entire nation that had, for 8 years, watched Michelle Obama carry her role with a grace that was now being trampled for sport. The next morning, as the digital world raged with debate and division, Barack's longtime lawyer, David Kendall, walked into his study holding a thick folder, a physical manifestation of the overnight firestorm. "Sir," he began, his voice low but firm, cutting through the quiet hum of the House, "this is defamation at a national level. You have every right to fight back." But Barack didn't answer at first. He just stared at an old photograph on his desk, a picture of Michelle, sleeves rolled up and smiling, her hands deep in the soil of the White House garden she had so lovingly cultivated. He saw not a first lady but his wife, a woman who had poured her soul into nurturing something good and real for the country's children. Then he whispered, his voice barely audible but weighted with a profound conviction, "It's not about me. It's about respect." Hours later, a breaking alert flashed across every screen, a digital shockwave that made the previous day's insult feel like a mere tremor. Obama sues Trump for $900 million, claims public defamation and emotional damage against his wife. Reporters went wild. The sum was staggering, designed not just to seek damages but to make a statement so loud it could not be ignored. Trump exploded on Truth Social, typing in all caps, his rage a torrential downpour of accusations and denials. He painted himself as the victim, a warrior for free speech under assault by the establishment. But behind the rage, behind the carefully constructed wall of public fury, something else was brewing deep within his inner circle. Fear. A cold, creeping fear. Because what the world didn't know was that this lawsuit wasn't a bluff. It was the opening salvo in a war, and Obama's legal team had evidence the world wasn't ready for. Inside the crowded press room at the National Press Club, the air was thick with a frenzied energy. Journalists shouted questions, their voices a chaotic chorus of disbelief and speculation. Why this? Why now? Is this about politics or personal revenge? The world demanded answers, hungry for the next chapter in a drama that had captivated and horrified them in equal measure. They were about to learn that this was about something far more fundamental than politics. It was a battle for the very soul of public discourse, a fight to prove that some things, dignity, truth, and respect, were still worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And the first piece of evidence was about to drop like a bomb. The lawsuit was more than a legal filing. It was a declaration, a line drawn not in the political sand, but in the moral bedrock of a nation. Inside the crowded White House press room, the air crackled with an energy that felt like a gathering storm. Journalists, seasoned veterans who thought they had seen it all, shouted questions over one another, their voices a chaotic symphony of desperation for a quote, a clue, a single shred of understanding. "Mr. Obama, why now? Why such a massive lawsuit?" one reporter yelled, his voice cutting through the din. When Barack Obama finally stepped to a podium later that day, he didn't come with fire and fury. He arrived with a stillness that commanded the room. He simply looked into the cameras, his gaze steady and unwavering, and delivered a line that would define the battle to come, because truth still matters. Meanwhile, 700 miles away, inside the historic confines of the White House, the truth felt like a closing vice. Donald Trump's face was a mask of crimson fury, his legendary temper reaching a boiling point. He paced the Oval Office like a caged lion, the sheer audacity of the lawsuit an affront to his very being. Across from him, Melania sat with an unnerving quietness, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. The only sound from her was the faint, rhythmic clinking of a diamond bracelet As she folded and refolded her hands in her lap, she let his rage fill the room, let it swell and crest until it had nowhere left to go. "Donald," she said finally, her voice soft but laced with steel, cutting through his tirade. "Maybe this time you went too far." He slammed his fist on the resolute desk, the sound echoing off the portraits of past presidents. "Too far?" he roared. "He's suing me because I spoke my mind. This is an attack on free speech." But before his rant could continue, his chief of staff burst into the room, his face pale, his eyes wide with a terror that instantly silenced his boss. "Sir," the man stammered, holding up his phone like a holy relic. "Sir, there's an audio clip. It's trending everywhere." Trump froze, the blood draining from his face. The chief of staff hesitated, visibly trembling. It's from that private dinner last month. Your remarks about Michelle Obama, they were recorded." Trump snatched the phone from his hand, his fingers jabbing at the screen. And then he heard it. His own voice, amplified and chillingly clear, played back to him. It wasn't just the overrated comment. It was worse. It was a torrent of mockery aimed at Michelle's looks, her family, her education at Princeton and Harvard. His voice was slick with contempt, each insult punctuated by the sycophantic laughter of his dinner guests. Across America the clip spread like a digital plague. The laughter that had once entertained a few powerful men in a private room now echoed as public cruelty to millions. And in the suffocating silence of the Oval Office, Melania whispered something Trump never expected, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Donald," she said, her voice barely a breath, "you've disgraced us both." The first day of the lawsuit was more than a legal proceeding. It was a global spectacle. The world's eyes were fixed on the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., a stoic building of granite and marble that was about to become the arena for a battle over America's soul. Barack and Michelle Obama arrived first, walking hand in hand through a gauntlet of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. Their faces were steady, carved from a resolve that seemed impervious to the chaos surrounding them. They were not angry, not proud, just resolute. They were there to defend a principle, and their quiet unity was a powerful statement in itself. Minutes later, Donald Trump arrived, his entrance a stark contrast. His jaw was tight, his eyes darting nervously toward the crowd, searching for allies and enemies. The tension was electric. It was as if the air itself had grown heavier, charged with the weight of history. Inside, the ornate courtroom fell into a hushed silence as Judge Harper, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor, called the case to order. The opening statements were brief and brutal. Then Obama's attorney stood, and with a simple nod, played the audio tape for the jury. The sound of Trump's voice filled the hall, the mocking tone, the cruel jokes, the chorus of privileged laughter. The sound was suffocating, and a palpable discomfort settled over the room. Even Trump's own lawyers shifted in their seats, their faces tight with unease. All eyes turned to Michelle Obama. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her composure did not break. She did not shrink. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, as if to absorb the blow. And when the tape finally ended, she spoke to her lawyer in a voice that was quiet, yet carried across the silent room. "This isn't about money," she said, her voice trembling just enough for every heart in the room to feel its vibration. "It's about dignity." In that moment, the entire case shifted. It was no longer about a financial sum. It was about an intangible, priceless human value. For the first time, Trump turned his gaze downward, his usual bravado completely gone. For a brief, unguarded second, something flickered in his eyes. Was it guilt? Or was it the terrifying, dawning realization that he was about to lose everything that mattered? Then Barack Obama stood. He didn't address the judge or the jury. He looked directly at Donald Trump, his gaze piercing and calm. "You insulted my wife in front of the world," he said, his voice even but resonant with power. "Now, the world will hear the truth." In that moment, as two presidents faced each other across a courtroom, America held its breath, knowing that the verdict, whatever it might be, would change them all. That night, the storm inside Trump broke free. He stormed through the Oval Office, his rage a desperate, flailing thing. His phone buzzed, and the name flashing on the screen froze him mid-stride. Melania! She had been staying in New York since the scandal broke, a silent, damning protest. "Donald," she said, her voice a low, controlled force of nature, "you need to apologize. Publicly." Trump let out a bitter, incredulous laugh. "You think I'll bow to Obama? Never." But Melania's tone didn't waver. It was cold as ice. "This isn't about him. It's about you. It's about the kind of man our son thinks you are." A profound silence hung on the line. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock behind him. Each tick a second of his legacy slipping away. Then she whispered the words that would shatter his defenses. "You can lose everything, Donald. Even your family." The call ended before he could reply, leaving him alone in the most powerful room in the world, feeling utterly powerless. Sleep offered Donald Trump no escape. That night, the vast, opulent bedroom of the White House felt like a prison cell. Every time he closed his eyes, he didn't see darkness. He saw Michelle Obama's face in the courtroom, her quiet strength a mirror reflecting his own ugliness. He heard her words echoing in the silence. "This isn't about money. It's about dignity." He tossed, he turned, he stared at the ornate ceiling, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a physical force. For the first time in years, perhaps since the stunning loss of the 2020 election, he felt a sensation he had long buried under layers of wealth, power, and bluster. Helplessness. And across the city, in a quiet hotel suite, Barack and Michelle sat in a different kind of silence. It wasn't the silence of defeat, but of weary resolve. They knew this was just the beginning. This fight was about to get uglier, more personal, and more revealing than anyone could possibly imagine. 3 days later, the next bomb dropped. David Kendall entered Barack Obama's temporary office, his face etched with a grim mixture of shock and determination. In his hand, he held a small, unmarked flash drive. "Mr. President," he said softly, his voice heavy. "This came anonymously. It was slipped to one of our junior associates. You need to see this." Barack, sensing the gravity, plugged the drive into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy, leaked footage from a Trump fundraiser. The very same night the infamous audio was recorded. The scene was sickeningly familiar. Trump, surrounded by a sea of fawning, laughing donors, holding court like a king. He was making the same cruel jokes about Michelle's appearance, her background, her achievements. The room roared with laughter, a grotesque symphony of derision. But then came the twist. A new voice, clear and sober, cut through the revelry. "You'll regret saying that if this gets out," one of the donors warned, a flicker of caution in his tone. Trump's reply was instant, arrogant, and chilling. He leaned forward, a predator's glint in his eyes, and sneered, "Let it. No one touches me." The clip was irrefutable. It wasn't just an insult. It was a boast of impunity, a declaration that he was above consequences, above decency. Barack leaned back in his chair, a profound silence filling the room. He felt a surge of cold fury, but as he looked over at his wife, he saw not a desire for revenge, but a deep sadness. Michelle reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. "This isn't about vengeance, Barack," she whispered, her voice a beacon of clarity in the storm. "It's about showing them that kindness is not weakness." The next morning, Obama's team announced they were submitting the new evidence to the court. The news hit the internet like a tidal wave. Within hours, a sense of panic began to ripple through Trump's legal team. The video was a smoking gun, and as it spread, the court of public opinion began to turn against him with a vengeance. Even those who had once cheered his bravado now saw it for what it was: cruel, unchecked arrogance. The world was watching, and the carefully constructed fortress around Donald Trump was beginning to crumble, brick by painful brick. The day the video evidence was presented, the atmosphere outside the courthouse was a tinderbox. The streets were a sea of competing ideologies, a microcosm of a deeply divided America. Protesters surrounded the building, their signs telling two different stories. On one side, thousands held posters with Michelle Obama's face, captioned with the word "respect." On the other, a smaller but equally fervent group shouted, Free speech matters. Their voices a defiant roar against what they saw as a political witch hunt. Inside, the air was suffocating. The tension was no longer just a feeling. It was a physical presence that seemed to press down on everyone in the room. Trump sat rigid at the defendant's table, his eyes fixed forward, his face a stony mask that betrayed nothing. Beside him, Barack Obama appeared calm, but his alertness was palpable, every movement deliberate, every glance measured. He was a man prepared for war. The judge's gavel struck, demanding order as the video was played for the jury on a large screen. The sound of Trump's voice, amplified and arrogant, filled the courtroom again, echoing like thunder. "Let it. No one touches me." The words hung in the air, a testament to a hubris so profound it bordered on delusion. As the clip ended, a stunned silence descended. Then a gasp rippled through the gallery. The doors at the back of the courtroom had opened, and Melania Trump walked in. Her entrance was a masterclass in silent drama. Dressed in a simple, elegant black dress, she moved with a quiet grace that defied the chaos. She didn't look at her husband. She didn't look at the press. Her eyes were fixed on one person. She quietly took a seat in the row directly behind Michelle Obama. Trump's face turned pale. This was a betrayal more profound than any leaked tape. This was a public alignment, a statement made without a single word. When the judge called for a brief recess, the room erupted in a frenzy of whispers. Melania stood, and with the eyes of the world upon her, she approached Michelle. She extended a hand, not for a handshake, but as a gesture of peace. She leaned in and whispered something only Michelle could hear. Michelle, in turn, listened, her expression softening, and gave a gentle, understanding nod. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed, but the moment was private, impenetrable. The two women, bound by the strange, isolating experience of being a first lady, walked out of the courtroom side by side, a silent, graceful, and unshaken pair. Back inside, alone at his table, Trump clenched his jaw so tightly it looked like it might crack. He stared at the empty seats where the two women had been, and a terrifying realization washed over him. This lawsuit was no longer about his words. It wasn't about money or defamation. It had become something much bigger, much more dangerous. It was about legacy. And as the court reconvened, Barack Obama looked at him one last time, his gaze steady and clear, before saying to his lawyer, loud enough for the entire room to hear, "Mr. Trump must understand. Even power can't silence decency." The room fell utterly, completely still. Back in the steel and glass fortress of Trump Tower in New York, the inner circle was unraveling. The air in the penthouse boardroom, usually thick with cigar smoke and arrogant confidence, was now choked with fear. His top legal advisor, a seasoned but now visibly nervous man named Mark Ellison, stared across the polished mahogany table at his client. "Mr. President," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "the video is airtight. The jury saw it. The world saw it. We need to consider a settlement. We need to stanch the bleeding." Trump's eyes, which had been staring blankly at the Manhattan skyline, burned with a sudden, renewed fire. "Settle?" he snarled, the word dripping with contempt. "I don't settle. I destroy." It was his mantra, his creed, the very foundation of the empire he had built. But then, the heavy boardroom door creaked open, and Melania entered. She had flown back to New York immediately after her courtroom appearance, and her presence now commanded an absolute chilling authority. Every man in the room, titans of industry and legal sharks, fell silent. They watched as she walked to the head of the table, her gaze fixed only on her husband. "Donald," she said, her voice calm and devoid of emotion, making it all the more powerful. "If you destroy everything, you destroy yourself." Trump shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. His voice trembled, not with power, but with the raw fury of a wounded animal. "You're taking their side now? After everything, you're standing with them?" Melania didn't flinch. She met his rage with an unshakable stillness. "No," she replied, her words precise and devastating. "I'm taking the truth's side." For a long, agonizing moment, Trump just stared at her, his mind reeling, unable to process this ultimate act of defiance. He turned away, gripping the edge of his massive desk so tightly his knuckles went white. The sound of New York traffic roared faintly from 40 floors below, a distant, mocking reminder that the world outside kept moving relentlessly, even as his own empire was cracking at its foundations. After she left the room in a wake of stunned silence, Mark Ellison leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Sir, there's more. The Obama's lawyer." They just received another anonymous submission. "The source confirmed it came from someone inside your team." Trump's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a new kind of horror. "Inside my... what?" The thought was inconceivable. A traitor, not just an enemy outside the gates, but a viper within his own nest. Someone in his most trusted circle was leaking his private comments, his moments of weakness, to the enemy. And whoever it was, he realized with a dawning, sickening dread, had just handed Barack Obama the final weapon. Miles away, in their Washington hotel, Michelle found a plain white envelope that had been slipped under their door. No name, no address, no return. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a handwritten note on elegant personal stationery. The handwriting was feminine, precise. It read, "He's not the same man he once was, but he needs to face the truth. I hope this brings closure. Signed simply, M." Attached to the note was a small black USB drive. Michelle hesitated for a moment, then walked into the living area and handed it to Barack. A profound understanding passed between them. They knew who M was. They plugged it in, and the final devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The file on the USB drive opened not with a bang, but with a whisper. It was an audio recording, clearly captured on a hidden phone. The sound quality was intimate, raw, and utterly damning. It was Melania's secret recording, taken during a private, unguarded conversation with her husband in the days after the scandal first broke. The world had heard Trump's public bluster and his courtroom defiance. Now, for the first time, Barack and Michelle were hearing the sound of the man behind the mask. Trump's voice was ragged, stripped of all its usual bravado. It was the sound of a man breaking. "I never meant to hurt her, Melania," he confessed, the word "her" referring to Michelle, with a strange, almost fearful reverence. I just wanted to sound powerful again. I wanted them to fear me again." A long silence followed on the recording, filled only by the sound of his strained breathing. Then Melania's quiet reply, spoken with a sad, weary wisdom. "Power doesn't come from belittling others, Donald. It comes from grace." Barack sat perfectly still, the laptop glowing in the dim light of the hotel room. A complex wave of emotions crossed his face. There was no victory, no triumphant vindication. Instead, there was a profound and unexpected sadness. "He's trapped," he murmured, more to himself than to Michelle. "He's a prisoner of the very image he built." Michelle reached out and touched his hand, her own eyes filled with a compassionate sorrow. "Then let's finish this with dignity," she said. "For everyone." The next day in court, when Obama's team submitted the new recording, the room didn't just gasp. It felt as though the collective air had been punched from its lungs. The sound of Trump's broken confession, his admission of insecurity and fear, filled the hallowed hall. It was the final, fatal blow. For the first time during the entire ordeal, Donald Trump couldn't look anyone in the eye. He stared at his hands, a man utterly and completely exposed. The trial reached its final fever-pitch week. The media, in a rare moment of unified sentiment, called it the most emotional court battle in modern American history. The crowds outside the courthouse swelled, a roiling sea of posters and chants, some screaming for justice, others now pleading for mercy. Inside, Trump looked like a ghost of his former self. He was exhausted, his once confident stare replaced by a haunted, vacant look. His lawyers whispered frantically in his ear, but he barely seemed to register their presence. It was then that Barack Obama took the stand one last time. He spoke calmly, his voice as steady as stone, a stark contrast to the emotional wreckage of the defendant. "I didn't sue to humiliate anyone," he said, his eyes sweeping across the jury, the judge, and finally landing on Trump. "I sued to remind this country that words matter, that a man's honor begins with how he treats women, especially those who stand for something good." The room was silent, hanging on his every word. Even Trump's most ardent supporters in the gallery couldn't look away. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, Donald Trump rose slowly to his feet. His lawyers tried to pull him back down, but he shook them off. His voice, when he spoke, was a raw, cracking whisper. I went too far," he said quietly, the admission costing him everything. "And maybe I forgot who I used to be." Gasps filled the courtroom. This was the apology the world never thought it would hear. Barack Obama didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply gave a slow, solemn nod. "Then maybe," he said softly, "this is where healing begins." But the jury hadn't spoken yet, and as the judge called for a final recess before deliberations, a low, ominous roll of thunder echoed outside, a storm finally breaking, mirroring the one that had been raging inside every heart in that room. Thunder rumbled across Washington, D.C. as ominous gray clouds swallowed the sky, unleashing a torrential downpour. Reporters huddled under a forest of umbrellas, their frantic voices drowned out by the relentless drumming of rain against the courthouse steps. Inside, the tension had become an unbearable physical thing. Michelle sat quietly, her fingers intertwined so tightly her knuckles were white. Barack placed his hand gently over hers, a silent anchor in the storm. "Whatever happens today," he whispered, his voice a calm current in the sea of anxiety, "we did what was right." Trump entered moments later, his hair damp, his expensive suit looking wrinkled and defeated. For the first time in his public life, there was no arrogance in his walk, only a profound weariness. His eyes, for a fleeting moment, met Michelle's across the room. She didn't look at him with hatred or triumph, but with a strange, calm sadness that seemed to pierce deeper than anger ever could. The rhythmic sound of rain hitting the massive arched windows filled the silence as Judge Harper entered. "Closing arguments will begin shortly," she announced, her voice echoing in the tense quiet. Trump leaned toward his lawyer, his facade finally crumbling. "If I apologize again, right now, will it matter?" His voice cracked with a desperation no one had ever heard from him before. The lawyer hesitated, looking at the broken man beside him. "It might, sir," he replied honestly, "but not to save your image, to save your soul." Outside, a brilliant fork of lightning illuminated the sky. Inside, the air felt just as electric. Obama's attorney rose to deliver his final words, and every camera, every eye, turned to him. This was no longer just a lawsuit. It was a mirror, being held up to the nation, forcing it to see what power without respect, what ambition without empathy, truly looks like. "Dignity," the lawyer concluded, his voice ringing with conviction, "cannot be bought, it cannot be sold, and it cannot be mocked into submission without a fight." The room erupted in murmurs. Then, in a final, shocking turn, Trump stood again. "Your Honor," he said, his voice hoarse but clear, "I'd like to say something." Judge Harper, sensing the gravity of the moment, nodded slowly. "Proceed, Mr. Trump." He didn't address the judge. He turned his body, his entire being, toward Michelle Obama. For a long moment, no one spoke. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. "I said cruel things," he began, his voice shaking. "Not because they were true, but because I was angry, jealous even. You had what I lost. Respect." Michelle blinked back tears, her composure finally wavering. Beside her, Barack's jaw tightened, but his expression remained a mask of calm control. "Mrs. Obama," Trump continued, his voice breaking completely, "I am sorry to you and to my wife." Gasps rippled through the audience. Melania, sitting quietly behind Michelle, visibly wiped a tear from her eye. Trump lowered his gaze to the floor. "I may never earn forgiveness," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I had to say it." As Trump sat down, a strange quiet filled the room. Not the silence of fear, but of profound reflection. For one brief, stunning moment, the nation saw not a caricature of bluster, but a man stripped bare by his own truth. The jury returned after 5 long, agonizing hours. Every heartbeat in the silent courtroom echoed like a drum. The forewoman stood, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper. "We, the jury," she announced, her voice ringing out, "find in favor of the plaintiff, Barack Obama." A wave of whispers spread instantly. Obama closed his eyes for a second, a silent prayer of thanks on his lips. Michelle squeezed his hand, tears of relief, not triumph, glistening in her eyes. The judge continued, "Damages are awarded in the amount of $900 million. Trump sat perfectly still. There was no outburst, no denial, just a heavy, deafening silence. His eyes flicked toward Michelle, and in a moment, seen by only a few, he gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod, the gesture of a man finally, completely, accepting his defeat. The morning after the verdict, the world awoke to screaming headlines. Obama wins $900 million lawsuit. Trump's legacy in crisis. A nation reckons with dignity. The story was on every channel, every website, every newspaper front page. Trump Tower, once a gleaming symbol of untouchable power, was swarmed by a horde of reporters, their cameras aimed like weapons at the golden doors. Inside, the once glittering marble lobby felt eerily quiet, like a mausoleum. In his penthouse office, Donald Trump sat at his desk, staring blankly at a television screen, cycling through images of his own humiliation. The world that once feared him, the world he had commanded with a single tweet, now pitied him. And for a man like Donald Trump, pity was a fate worse than death. Melania entered the office, her movements silent and graceful. She held a folder in her hands. "The lawyers want to appeal," she said softly, her voice neutral. He didn't look up from the screen. "No," he said, his own voice hollowed out, devoid of its usual fight. "I'm done." For the first time in decades, his voice carried no pride, no anger, only the bone-deep weariness of a king who had lost his kingdom. Melania came to his side and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. It was a gesture of unexpected tenderness. "You can rebuild, Donald," she said, her voice full of a quiet strength. "But this time, start with your heart, not your image." He finally lifted his head and met her eyes. His were filled with a confusion, a vulnerability she hadn't seen since they were first married. Do you think they'll ever forgive me?" he asked, the question hanging in the air like a prayer. She paused, considering her words carefully. "Forgiveness isn't given, Donald," she replied. "It's earned." Meanwhile, across the country in Chicago, Barack and Michelle sat at their dining table in a profound and peaceful quiet. There was no celebration, no champagne, no triumphant phone calls. There was just a shared sense of calm, the feeling of a long, brutal storm finally having passed. Michelle broke the silence, her voice soft. "Do you think he'll change?" she asked, the question laced with a cautious hope. Barack sighed, his gaze drifting out the window to the calm blue waters of the lake. "People only change," he said thoughtfully, "when they're forced to realize what they almost lost." Outside, the city of Chicago bustled with life, unaware of the quiet moment of reflection taking place. But for two former presidents, and the two women who stood by them, life would never be the same again. A week later, in a move that captivated the nation once more, Barack and Michelle appeared on a special primetime interview with CNN. The host asked the question on everyone's mind. "Mr. President, what message do you hope this case sends to America?" Barack smiled, not the broad political smile of his campaign days, but a softer, more reflective one. "That strength isn't in how loud we speak," he said, "but in how calmly we stand for what's right." Michelle added, her voice resonating with a powerful grace, "and that women everywhere deserve respect, not because of who they married, but because of who they are." The interview went viral. Millions watched. Many moved to tears as Michelle spoke about the deep, personal pain of being mocked on a global stage, and how forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but choosing to heal. In his silent penthouse, Trump watched the same interview alone. The sound of Michelle's steady, dignified voice filled the vast empty room. He turned down the volume, and in the quiet, whispered to himself, "She's stronger than I ever was." He stood, walked to the balcony, and looked out over the sprawling city he once believed he ruled. Now it was just a reminder of everything he had broken, including himself. For the first time, he felt the sting of truth not as a punishment, but as a moment of painful, searing clarity. A month after the verdict, a different kind of message went viral. It wasn't a tweet, a news report, or an interview. It was a heartfelt open letter, posted by Barack Obama on social media. It read, in part, "This victory was never about money. It was about teaching our children that dignity always matters, especially when it's mocked. We do not rise by tearing others down, but by lifting up what is right and what is good." The letter transcended politics. It spread like a healing balm across a wounded nation, uniting Americans across party lines. Churches read it from the pulpit on Sundays. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. It became a powerful symbol not of revenge, but of moral courage and the quiet strength of conviction. In a surprising, almost unbelievable twist, Trump's office released a response a few days later. It wasn't a press release or a digital post. It was a photo of a handwritten note on his personal letterhead. The script was shaky, uncertain, but the words were clear. "I have lost much, but I have learned more from this than from any victory in my life. To Michelle Obama, I was wrong. To Barack, I respect what you stood for. To America, I will try to do better." For days, the internet buzzed with disbelief. Many called it a political ploy, a cynical attempt at rehabilitation. But others saw something new, something they never thought they'd see from Donald Trump: humility. When Michelle read the note, she didn't comment on its sincerity. She simply folded it and said quietly, "Maybe grace found its way in after all." Barack smiled faintly. "It always does, Michelle," he replied. "Eventually, it always does." The world had witnessed a haunting story of power, pride, and ultimately love. A story of humiliation, forgiveness, and the painful public transformation of a man. Weeks passed, and the lawsuit faded from the headlines, but its echoes lingered in the American consciousness. One morning, Barack and Michelle received one last envelope, marked "Private and Personal," from Donald J. Trump. Inside was another letter, longer this time. "Barack," it began, "you fought for something I had forgotten: respect. I have lost friends, allies, and even my own pride. But for the first time, I think I understand what real leadership means. Please, tell Michelle I am sorry. Not as a politician, but as a man who has finally learned what it means to be humbled." Michelle read it silently, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. "No cameras, no tweets," she said softly. "Just truth." Barack nodded. "Then maybe this was never about winning," he mused. "It was about awakening." That evening, Barack walked outside as the sun dipped low over Washington, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air smelled faintly of rain, fresh, clean, forgiving. For the first time since the trial began, he felt a profound and lasting peace. Somewhere far away, on a balcony overlooking a city of lights, another man stood alone, watching the same sunset. Two men, once bitter rivals, both quiet, both humbled, both irrevocably changed. The world didn't know it yet, but something deep inside the heart of America had shifted, perhaps forever. The final chapter was written not in a courtroom, but at Howard University's graduation, where Michelle Obama took the stage. "When someone insults you," she told the sea of hopeful young faces, her voice glistening with emotion, "don't trade hate for hate. Stand tall. Let your silence speak your worth. Even when the world mocks you, don't lose your kindness, because kindness will outlive every headline." The crowd erupted in an ovation that felt like a prayer. Her words became a beacon, a reminder that true strength doesn't come from vengeance. It comes from grace.